Friends, today, a little bit behind the scenes. Do you remember way back in the day when we drove the then SRT, now Dodge Viper? Well, we got into a shit ton of trouble with Chrysler for this clip.
74 Super Duty 4-speed Trans Am also that I
So you're a
put
Pontiac
together.
guy.
Oh yeah,
This is the
love
godfather of the engine of the Viper, is a Pontiac and kind of a Chevrolet guy.
Well, yeah, and I tell some people, it's half joking but almost half serious that there's a little bit of Pontiac DNA in every Viper because of, what I learned working on GTOs and Trans Ams.
Now since then, our old friend Mr. Winkles has retired from Chrysler. So now that we're all up to speed, let's go into Dick's garage and find out what really inspired the engines of all those Vipers.
Talking about a real engine today, my 1970 Pontiac GTO Ram Air 4 engine. So as you can see on this car, it's all about the engine. There's none of the other stuff you see today, no air conditioning, no power brakes, no power steering. It's all about the engine. And this is a really special engine. Pontiac only made about 600 Ram Air 4s in 1970, and there was only about 300 GTOs that were fitted with the Ram Air 4. So this is a pretty special car, and I knew that from day one. The engine has special cylinder heads with big round exhaust ports. It's got cast exhaust manifolds that match those ports, kind of a header style design. An aluminum two-piece intake manifold. It's got 1.65 rocker arms, which the standard Pontiacs came with 1.5s. Carburetors specially jetted for this engine, distributors unique to this engine. So everything about this thing is kind of one-off stuff, really a neat deal. And this particular car has a neat feature too. With the hood tack, it's got the northern cars built for the northern states had this little heater hose that goes from the top of the heater to the hood tack. And that's a really kind of unusual thing that you rarely see because it was only the northern cars built in the Pontiac plant that got that. So this car was built right here in Pontiac, not 5 miles from here, I suppose, 5 or 6 miles. So this car has always spent its entire life here in Michigan. The transmission is an M21 close ratio. I put an aluminum flywheel on it to reduce the inertia, get it so it spins up faster. I've ported the cylinder heads. The Pontiacs are notorious for a bad exhaust port with a very bad short side radius, so I went in there and ported it by hand. The intake ports are all ported. I put in a little different camshaft compared to the original Ram Air 4 that's got a little more duration in it, and it's more computer designed rather than the old style by the drawing board kind of design. So this engine, actually, I think it tends to run a little smoother than a normal Ram Air 4.
Second gear, she comes alive. Where does peak torque come in on this car?
I think it's 4,000 or something like that.
Yeah, it feels like it's higher. It's almost, it's not an S2000 kind of thing, but you definitely have to rev her out.
Oh yeah, whenever I'm running the car hard, you don't shift until you get to 6 grand.
And what is the factory horsepower with this?
370 horsepower rated. But of course they said they were underrated.
So what do you think it really is?
I think they were probably closer to 400. This one's probably a little more with the work I've done to it.
Okay, and then torque?
I think it was 450, but I'm not certain.
Jesus, that is a hell of a torque monster. 450? Holy crap.
Yeah, it was as much as the original Viper was.
So if you really think about it, 450 and the car weighs 3,700 pounds.
Yeah.
That's why she gets up and goes.
Yeah.
That's not bad power-weight ratio.
No.
It really isn't. That's almost modern-day territory. It's just that it's totally not composed.
No. And I've run this car at the strip a time or two. The best time I ever had was a 1289 at 109. So it's pretty quick.
Have you ever been a track day guy?
Nah. I like to go straight.
Judging by your collection.
Yeah. So in 1970, the GTO was an option on the Le Mans. It was its own model, but it added things to Le Mans. So it was different than the way the GTO started out in, say, 1964, when it was truly just an option. The GTO in 1970 was its own base model. So you would see a Le Mans that looked, similar to this car. It had the same body and lines and everything, but The thing that differentiated it from a GTO was, of course, the engine and the trans, but then there was a lot of other little bits in the chassis, suspension, wheels, and tires that made it different as well. The GTO had, generally speaking, had the bigger wheels and tires that came standard on it. In '70, it came with 14-inch wheels. This car I put on 15-inch wheels because I could get better tires for it. It has more grip. Obviously, the bigger tires are better in many respects. But back in 1970, the 14-inch wheels and tires were as good as they had at the time. The GTO also had a rear sway bar that the Le Mans did not have, which helped the body sway, obviously helped the handling of the car. The GTO came with different springs and shocks than what the Le Mans had, generally higher spring rates and different valve shocks. And then there was, of course, the differential was a positraction differential where the Le Mans just had an open diff. Originally, this car had a 10-bolt rear end in it, and it's been upgraded to a 12-bolt that the original owner put in back in about 1971 or 2. It's got 410 gears in it, where originally it had 390 gears, so it's very similar to the same gearing. Beyond that, there's been a lot of things I've done to the car to try to upgrade the chassis and suspension. I've added polyurethane bushings to everything, which really helped reduce the body sway and the lean on the car. I've actually upped the spring rates on the rear. I've changed some of the shocks are all different, some of the more modern shocks on the car. So this car actually handles pretty well now by standards of a 1970 car.
I think these get a worse rap than they are in reality. I think people don't realize how, I don't want to call this a pussycat to drive, but it's somewhere between docile and a handful. It's not a handful that everybody would think.
Yeah, it can get to be a handful in a hurry though.
Bad weather, obviously.
Well, when I first got the car really running good back after I bought it, I took it out on one of the deserted roads, you know, by where I lived.
Yeah.
And I was rolling through the gears thinking, wow, this thing feels pretty good. So I don't know, I had shifted into fourth gear, so I was probably going 70, 80, 90 miles an hour. And up the road quite a ways, the car pulled out onto the road. And I thought, no problem. You know, and I hit the brakes. Well, back then it had drums, now it's got discs, but hit the brakes.
You upgraded these?
I upgraded this, yeah.
You didn't tell us that.
It was 4 drums.
And it's 4 discs now?
No, it's 2 discs up front, not power. But,
so now what happens when you go to a show? This has won a lot of awards.
Yeah.
So when you go to a show, there's obviously some things that are not original.
Yep. The GTO Nationals, for example, you're allowed a few modifications in the modified restored class. So you just declare them and you're actually okay.
Nothing was precision about this. This was all, you're buying the car by the pound, and really all the engineering went into the motor. Especially as I'm going around a turn right now and we're almost like falling off to the side.
The GTO had the different graphics on it than what the Le Mans had. This car has the optional hood tack that originally came on this car, which was a fairly unique option, but a very cool option. It just had that cool factor that went along with it, and I think it complemented the hood scoops really well as well. Oddly enough, in 1970, the GTO or the Le Mans did not have sport mirrors. That came actually in 1971. So you see this car only has 1 mirror on the driver's side, and it's a chrome mirror, so it's not nearly as sporty looking as what the bullet style sport mirrors would have been a year later.
I do like some of the upgrades you did on the interior. Like, I really like the wheel.
Yeah.
I think that adds a lot.
This car didn't have a console either, and I like a console.
Was the console even available?
Yeah. This car had very few options. It had the ram air engine, it had an AM radio. I put the AM FM in it.
Oh, I see the FM.
Yeah.
Okay. And is this turn dash, was that part of it?
Yeah, that's stock. It had the hood tack.
Obviously no air conditioning.
No air.
And then what would have went here? The spacer in the dash?
I don't think anything went there, actually, that I can think of.
It's just Pontiac.
Yeah. So yeah, I added spoilers, the console.
Was the spoiler a factory option?
You could get it on a non-Judge car, yeah.
But the Judge, you couldn't even get this. The Judge was like...
Yeah, you could get this on the Judge.
You could get this on every Judge I've seen. I haven't seen one.
In reality, the Judge was meant to be a stripped down...
Yeah, like the Roadrunner
version of the car, like a Roadrunner. But in reality, at the end of the day, most people loaded them up. So you find that most judges have more options on them than most other GTOs.
See, now here would be my dilemma. After I would have to get the obligatory, like, early C3 and some other classics, I don't know what I would get out of one of these. This, the Buick, or the Oldsmobile. And I grew up on Buicks and Chevys. I wouldn't get the Chevy because that's what everybody has. And I wouldn't want that just because everybody's got one. It's like the 911 of these type of cars.
Yeah.
But outside of that, like the Buick has its unique little things. The Oldsmobile has its unique things about it. Then of course there's the Pontiac, and you know I've owned 2 Pontiacs.
I think Pontiac had the most character out of the bunch, to be honest.
Oh, well, if you look at the design from the front, absolutely.
Yeah.
And then all of these have higher value than all of their respective Mopars, of course, with the exception of the weird ones like the Superbirds. A Hemi Superbird
Well,
is still...
any Hemi cars.
Yeah, crazy money. But like when you think of like a 440 Roadrunner or something like that.
I just felt like the GM cars were so much better all around. I think Chrysler had the best engines.
Mm-hmm.
They had the best powertrains, but I didn't care for their styling. The cars just seemed cheap.
Well, outside of the Challenger, they had no style.
No, they didn't.
GM back in the day, it was literally the style was pouring out of Warren, Michigan.
Yeah.
Like, look at the front of this car. The idea of putting plastic as a nose on a car like this.
Imagine that. I first saw this car in 1972. I was working at a grocery store, bagging groceries, and one of the other guys that worked there was a guy named Wayne Ladd. And Wayne and I bagged groceries together, and one night Wayne was saying that he had driven his brother's GTO in, and he said, let's go for a cruise after work. And I said, hey, sounds good to me. So we went out, and here's this blue GTO sitting out in the parking lot at the grocery store, and he was showing all these neat little features to me. The hood scoops, or the flaps in the scoop that kind of open and close, he was showing that. The hood tack, and I'd never, frankly, honestly seen a car like this before. So he and I went driving around a little bit in it that night, and little did I know that I'd be standing with it here some, 47 years later or something, 43 years later. But Steve Ladd was the original owner, Wayne's brother, and Steve sold it to another guy that worked at the grocery store, a guy named Mike Robbins, back in roughly 1975, I think it was, 4 or 5, because I already had my Z28 when Mike bought this car. And this car was really too much car for Mike Robbins. And so Mike kept the car about 3 years. He managed to get, I think, his soon-to-be wife pregnant in the back seat of this car. And he had to sell it, so he sold it to another friend of mine that I talked into buying this car, because Kevin, my other friend, had a 76 Trans Am that he had bought that was dog slow back in the day. And I said, buy the GTO from Mike, and we could swap the engine and put the engine in there and do some really cool stuff, make it really fast. So he ended up buying the car, and luckily we never actually swapped the engine out or anything, because that would have been a shame to do that to this car. But he kept the car for about 3 years and drove it on and off. The clutch went out of it in 1980, and about that time, his soon-to-be wife got pregnant, so I don't know if it was something to do with the car or what, but he decided to sell the car. He had to sell the car, and I said, gee, what do you want for it? I'll give you $1,000. So I bought the car from him for $1,000 and thought, well, I can put a clutch in it, I can clean it up, and I can probably sell it and make a handy profit real quick. So I bought the car, I put the clutch in it, it needed a new flywheel. Got it running, got it cleaned up pretty nice, and drove the car around and decided, gee, this is a pretty neat car, you know, and I thought about selling it probably for years. I talked about it, but I could just never really part with it. So I've owned the car since 1980, so it's been 35 years now that I've had it, and I did a frame-off restoration on it back in 2000, and the car is really clean. It's really interesting that it's a Michigan car. Again, it was built probably 5 or 6 miles from here in Pontiac, Michigan. It was sold in Clarkston, Michigan, which is about 10 or 15 miles from here. And Steve Ladd, the original owner, bought it, and he lived in Goodrich, Michigan. So it's a Michigan car all its life, and yet it managed to somehow survive without really any rust, because pretty much all the owners didn't drive it in the winter and took pretty good care of it. So it survived with really all of its original panels. It's To my knowledge, there's nothing that's not original except for the front valence, which got wrinkled up a few times, so I did replace that. But everything else on the car is original metal, and there was very little rust in the car, so it's a very nice car, and I enjoy the heck out of it.